Support for this podcast comes from listeners like you. This is an ad-free show and donations are greatly appreciated. To learn more and make a contribution, go to authenticparenting.com/support. Thank you for your generous and kind support. It means the world to me. I am Anna Seewald, and this is Authentic Parenting, a podcast about growing ourselves while raising our children. I'm a psychologist, educator, and parent coach. And on this podcast, I explore how you can connect to your authentic self, practice radical self-care, and raise emotionally healthy children. Let's break the generational cycle of trauma for a more peaceful, kind, and compassionate world. Today, growing up in public, thought-provoking, helpful, and important conversation about children and technology. I am speaking with Devorah Heitner. She is an expert on children and the internet and has a forthcoming book, Growing Up in Public, Coming of Age in a Digital World. I had a chance to read an advanced copy and I can highly recommend it. It's a book on helping parents and kids navigate growing up in a world where nearly every moment of their lives can be shared and compared. Devorah's previous book, Screenwise, Helping Kids Thrive and Survive in Their Digital World, was an Amazon bestseller and wildly praised. She has spoken at top companies and schools all over the world, and her writing on kids and technology has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN Opinion, and Fast Company, among others. In today's conversation, we talked about what impact do constant surveillance and digital exposure have on children, what do most parents fear, in this disclosure culture, what to share, how much to share or not to share, where is the balance, what to do when your child goes viral for the wrong reasons, how children and parents understand privacy, why a fear-based approach to protecting your child's safety can breed secrecy and distrust, and how to foster trust and connection with children, as well as sexting, sending and receiving nudes, and so much more. I had 6 pages of notes and I thoroughly enjoyed talking to Devorah. This is a fantastic conversation that every parent needs to hear. Please enjoy. Devorah, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I know it's been a long time. I've known you online and your name is in my book. I have this notebook that I keep of potential guests since the beginning of the podcast, and I've never invited you to the show. It's kind of strange that it took me a long time to have you on the podcast, but I love your voice in this technology, digital age education world. It's pretty sound and balanced and not over the top. So I'm really excited to have this conversation with you today.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Congratulations on the new book.
Thank you. It was a lot writing during the pandemic. So that was a big unexpected challenge. Like I was interviewing all these kids and then suddenly it was harder to find kids for a while.
Growing Up in Public, it's a really compelling title.
Thank you. It was so clear to me that this was a title, but I had to fight for it. People were like, no one will understand what that means. At my publisher, they thought it would sound like a book about public school. And I was like, no, I think people will understand what it means.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do. I think we're all growing up in public and living in public, even adults. You know, the privacy versus public versus private it's so elusive. There are no boundaries. And I really want to start with that, what privacy means to us parents and what privacy means to kids. I know you have a teenager, I have a teenager. I feel like we don't give enough credit to our children oftentimes. And I know that there are differences how I understand privacy or parents versus kids. I want to hear your expertise on this.
Yeah, definitely. I think the kids do have a strong idea of certain kinds of boundaries, right? They don't want to be tracked on Life 360 by their parents. They don't want to be kind of overshared on their parents' social media, but they may be less aware of data privacy, algorithmic privacy. So in the book, I call those like big privacy, small privacy, but they're both real. in the privacy of like not having your mom share something about you that's more personal on her Instagram, for example, is real, but also not thinking about like who has my data. So we want kids to understand both of those things.
Yes. I think as children get older, they don't want their parents to share about them. And I mean, it's a tricky thing for parents to navigate, right? And why do we want to share about our children's, their accomplishments? It feels like there are different kinds of parents. I fall into the camp. I don't share anything about my life. I'm not interested in, like, why would I share about my life? Like, who is interested in my life? But I see other people share. What can you say about, I mean, do parents need to ask consent of their children when they share about their children?
I think ideally they would ask for consent. That's actually something I've been saying even since my first book and before, since Screenwise and even earlier, because ideally, if you're asking your kids for consent, you're teaching them that that's something they should do as well. They should ask their friends for consent or their siblings or you, right? They shouldn't take a picture of you and put it on the internet without your consent. It's not just images, even stories or news about your kids. And when your kids are younger, they may not really understand what you're asking. And so you need to really talk with them about it, or if in doubt, just don't share it. If your kid is too young to understand that concept, then maybe just don't share it. If you're not sure, if you think it might be embarrassing later, think about the most self-conscious they'll ever be. If they're 4 and dancing in their underpants, think about them at 13 and would they want that picture out there? And if you're not sure, then maybe don't share it, or just share with grandma, or just, share with like one person in the family that will appreciate it and will keep it private, versus on social media where it's completely out of your control. Even if you have pretty good settings on your social accounts, you really can't predict who's going to see something once it goes there. And the data itself is with that company, which should make you at least a little bit concerned. Whereas if you share it, with one other person or your co-parent or something, that's a little bit different.
So then what are the dangers of oversharing?
We can really put a lot of pressure on our kids to maintain a certain narrative. Like if you're the gymnast or the violinist, or your parents are sort of, what if you want to leave that activity and your parents have been creating this narrative about you? Or what if you're just self-conscious about certain things, or you don't want everyone in the world to know about them? I think it's really important for kids to be able to write their own story and their own narrative, and to also make their own mistakes and make their own experiments with their identity, and not have that be such a so exposed in public.
Yeah, so true. You write about this YouTube star who I was not aware of, Amazing Sylvia or Awesome Sylvia, who later changed their gender. Can you speak about that? Because it's a good example that illustrates that we don't want our children to be tied to this specific persona that we create online. I know of a particular family, they post things of their child singing, but their child went to college. They're not interested in singing anymore. Somehow the parents see her through this narrow lens, and she went to a completely different route. But that was her identity for many years on Facebook, because her parents shared that. So I don't know what the harms of that are for that child, but I could see potential things there.
It's tricky because I'm sure it was done in a loving way, right? Like they didn't share in a way to shame or embarrass her. They were probably just so proud, and, they love her voice and they wanted to share it with people, right? So I think people do it for mostly positive reasons. I mean, there's like a small percentage of people on the internet who are sort of, I would say, like exploiting their kids for money and influence. But I would say the vast majority of parents, when they share or even overshare about their kids, they're doing it from a loving place and they want to connect with others. And I think parenting, especially in the last few years, can be very isolating. We want people to see what's going on in our families. We're hungry for connection. So I really want to have empathy for parents who are sharing about their kids, but also say we really have to think about our kids. And again, not just right now where it might seem fun, but even in the long term where it might feel like, oh, we're creating a narrative where kids can't get out of it. And yeah, I think the situation with Zephyr, who is a young adult now, is that, he became famous as a kid when his public gender identity was different. And when he recognized like, oh, I'm a boy or a young man, like then having this public image and past where he had been represented as a girl and as a role model for girls in STEM, like not just a girl, but like the whole being of a girl was part of what made the Super Awesome Sylvia brand, if you will, such a big deal. right? Like, of course, boys in STEM are cute too, but girls in STEM are this whole thing right now in our society. And, again, that's coming from a positive place. Like, I'm a feminist. I want to see girls in STEM. I want to see, like when, my son was like, oh, the girls at school all got taken to do this special engineering field trip. I was like, that's great. Like, and he totally understood. I was like, yeah, do you understand why like girls need some extra support around this because they've been prevented from having access to this field and, they don't see as many examples that look like themselves. So for Zephyr to say, I'm a boy is complicated given that whole narrative, but that's his truth. And I think it's really important for us to recognize if we create a brand or participate in creating a brand around our kids when they're young, and then they grow to self-identify in a different way. And obviously being transgender is one way that can happen, where it's a fairly profound difference. And maybe your old pictures and your old name are not going to be something comfortable. And I mean, in the transgender community, people talk about dead naming. Well, if there's a brand out there with your old name on it, like, it's going to be hard to get away from, in a different way than if you have a smaller public footprint. I mean, anyone who comes out as transgender is going to have some old pictures, and right, like that's a scenario that exists for anyone in that situation. But if it's bigger and more public and it's beyond just your family, then that's just a bigger mountain to climb. And to have to deal with that as a young adult is a lot. And so I think there are many reasons why we want to think carefully about our kids' narratives and make sure that they get to own those narratives. I don't think that means we can never share our families at all. But I do think we want to exercise some caution in how we do it, and also with whom. Like, a lot of us haven't thought that much for years about who's in my social media. And for people like you and I do share a little bit about my family, but I'm also pretty private. But I have this old public identity as an author. And I'm not so famous that I like get, accosted by paparazzi walking down the street. So it's not like when I talk about in the book, like Gwyneth Paltrow's daughter saying, like, don't share about me. Obviously, like, if you're a movie star, that's even a different level in people's fixation with your kids and like wanting to know private details. Thankfully, like, I don't live in a world where, people are recognizing me at the grocery store and trying to take my picture, right? But I do have people outside my family who I don't know who follow me on Instagram, on Twitter, or whatever, because of what I do with my work. And do those people want to know things about my family? Does my kid want to be shared with those people, right? Like, I think that's really an important question to ask yourself. And even for people whose use of social media is purely personal, like your day job has nothing to do with your social, I still think it's important to think about those boundaries. If you have other kids over, that are not your children, maybe don't share those on social media with those pictures without, again, asking parents. I think a lot of parents would love a cute picture of their kid playing with your kid at the playground, but just text it to the parents, don't post it, right? I think that's such an important way to teach our kids those boundaries and allow them to consider themselves in the ways they want to be seen.
I think many of us, I mean, this technology, I think, emerged and developed so rapidly and fast. We didn't have time to understand the rules, the guidelines. I think a lot of people were just in it, and only now we're learning about boundaries, about consent. It seems like in the beginning it was fun, everybody was doing it. But I think I like what you're sharing. Even in the book, you write about sharing has to be tied to your values. And you talk about teaching our children about intentional sharing. I think that's a big distinction. And you're right. Oftentimes I see people share a group photo where their child is in it, a graduation picture or before prom picture or things like that. And there's like 15 other kids. And I'm like, wow, this is kind of not okay. I've experienced that. I don't post pictures of me, my family on Facebook. I don't use Facebook, but I use social media primarily for work purposes, right? And I do share on the podcast about my life and things like that, but it's obviously filtered. I don't expose myself and disclose myself to the public. I consider what I share.
The kids are disclosing more than we would have in a different way.
Yes.
And I think that's also important too, that we live in a world where now disclosures about things like mental health or queerness or neurodiversity, for example, are part of the culture. And I think in many ways that is a positive change. But I would say that's your kids to share. If your kid wants to share that they have dyslexia or ADHD, if they want to share that they are, in recovery from an eating disorder, which is like, these are vulnerable shares. And I wouldn't necessarily encourage my kid to share this everything about these things. But if they want to share that, especially as part of being part of an affinity group, or if they want to share experiences they've had with microaggressions and dealing with racism, if they want to share experiences of survivorship, I think it's really important that we recognize that kids are sharing. If they want to share their LGBTQ identity, these are things that kids are sharing, and adults now. And I think we also have to validate and celebrate that the culture has shifted, and that things that we were taught as kids never to talk about. Didn't even have to be told. I was in therapy in high school. I didn't even have to be told not to share. It was so taboo to be in therapy in the community that I grew up in that I don't even think anyone ever said, don't tell anyone. I just lied to my friends and said, oh, I have something. I have a doctor's appointment. I have an orthodontist appointment, whatever. I have to go. And I was going to therapy, but I don't think any of my friends knew. And I think now kids would be more likely maybe to say, oh, I got to go, I have therapy. So we live in a different culture. And I'm not saying it's not your kid's right to keep that private, by the way. If your kid wants to keep it private and say, I have an orthodontist appointment, or not explain and go, that's also fine. I'm not saying your kid has to disclose that they're getting mental health support. I'm just saying we live in a culture where I think we've moved the needle quite a bit on what's acceptable and supported and what you could say to a friend. And I think that is a good thing. So as much as I want to support kids' privacy, I also think a lot of parents worry that their kids are disclosing, like, oh my gosh, my kid came out as gay, but do they have to tell everyone? Or, oh my gosh, my kid has ADHD, but do they have to tell everyone? And I'm like, if they want to, then they're making the world better in a lot of ways. And, if you're worried about discrimination, do you want them with friends or in a job where they wouldn't want someone who has that identity? Like, by disclosing, by coming out, and I'm using that really broadly, by coming out, we're also changing the cultures. So I just think that's really important too, is like the flip side of that privacy. But I agree, like I don't disclose a lot about my family, but I will say that there are people who do. And I think there are ways to do it more honestly and more ethically. Like a friend of mine wrote an incredible memoir about some of her daughter's early health struggles and what they went through as a family. And she did it with her daughter, who was then like 16 when she, published the book, full consent. And her daughter said, you know what, I don't want to read it, but you can tell the story. But she wouldn't have done it otherwise. And I think that's really important too.
I think it's very tricky. I do understand the upsides of disclosure and sharing about ADHD, neurodiversity, coming out, all of this, and finding support and affinity. There are also drawbacks, obviously, to everything. I just recently, my daughter's friend's mother passed away, and she went on Snapchat and posted about that right away. And we had a conversation with my daughter. I felt like, wow, this must be so terrifying and scary for this kid. Like, who she has to talk about this. She went on there. But what did the friends say? They said supportive words, but was that enough for that kid? It's very tricky. I had a conversation with my daughter about that, and I'm not sure. Was that appropriate? Was not appropriate? It feels like it was useful to this girl to some extent, right? Everybody said, supportive words, but was it really helpful? Was this the way to announce that her mother passed away? Did other people who didn't need to know about this? You know what I mean? It was like, I was conflicted. I wasn't sure where I stand on that.
I mean, I think kids are using social for all of those things. And I mean, another example that I heard about was that I didn't share in the book was a kid who announced that they lost their virginity on, and literally posted was like, I'll be back in an hour. Like, I'm not going to be a virgin anymore when I come back. And then like came back a couple hours later and was like, okay, I did it, I mean, but if you think about life in a college dorm or something, you might have that level of disclosure. Like you really might have come back to like your college roommate and been like, guess what I did? I mean, depends on your personality. That might not have been what I would have done, but I certainly knew people who made those kinds of very open disclosures. So I think it serves a purpose, but what you hope is that someone gets support. And this is what I write about in Growing Up in Public, like whether you have depression or whether you go through a terrible loss, like losing a parent as an adolescent is obviously a very big deal. Losing a parent at any age is a major life trauma, but as a young person, that's a very hard thing. And it's also, as someone who, like, I lost my mother at 22 and my sister was 14, and I'll just say, like, your friends haven't been through it yet, so they also don't know how to support you that well. Her friends at 14 wanted to support her, wanted to give her all of that love, but it's very different when you lose your parents in middle age and your friends know what to say and they know to show up with food and there's a protocol. And I think it's very difficult to go through a loss that other people around you and your peers haven't been through because they really don't know what to do. And so, and to say something on social media is a way to generate that, positive warmth and attention, but it is fleeting. And one of the things I've really learned studying social media, and there's a lot of research on this, is it doesn't help you for long. It's true. Like getting those kind comments on Snapchat are not going to be the same as seeing a therapist, being in a grief support group, having the friends show up for you day in and day out to eat lunch with you, to call you up if you're not leaving your bed, you need all of those things. So the initial rush of attention and support that we can get on social media, whether it's for sad news or even good news, like to celebrate some positive things, doesn't last in the same way that ongoing in-person close interactions do. And what I tell kids is we really want to think about friends versus followers as well, because a follower just pressed a button. And a follower can be a lot of people, but your friends, you can probably count on one hand, like your close friends, maybe two hands if you're very social, but we're not talking about fingers and toes here. Like we're not talking about a 3 or 4 digit number. So when kids say I have 100 or 1,000 or 5,000 followers, that's not close reciprocal relationships. That's people who pressed a button because they liked something you shared, whether that's a picture of yourself in a bikini or a picture of yourself like on a mountain, or because they know a bunch of your friends and they're just following a bunch of people. And I think it's very true that it's very important to separate the idea of a following from close friendships and make sure kids understand the importance of close reciprocal relationships. And so like for your daughter and the other kids who are around this kid, like, what can we really do to show up for this person? And it might be a year from now on the anniversary of her mother's death. It might, it's not just today, it's not just tomorrow. Like when someone goes through something like that, it's a long, it's a long process of supporting them and showing up for them. And I think we need to teach kids what that really looks like in a friend, and by modeling that in our own friendships. And I know for me and my husband, like we have been realizing we need to do more to kind of feed and water the garden of our own friendships, because our son will leave home and go to college and we're like, we need more of a life. We need, we need to keep our friendships going, and we need him to see that friends are important. It's not just all about his life. So, but I think we're also modeling like, yeah, we have lifelong friends that we care about, that we show up for, that we would get on an airplane to go see, or that we would inconvenience ourselves in some way to show up for them. And kids really need to see that those friendships transcend the sort of easy, quick interactions on social media. I think that said, those quick interactions are very kind of validating for kids. And even like the Snapchat streaks and some of the things that adults are like, whatever to, there are kids who are getting a little bit of a lifeline from that. I just think they need both and. Like, I don't think the Snapchat is bad, but they might need more, and they might need to recognize in themselves, okay, this has a limit. This isn't feeding me fully. I'm still hungry. That was like a snack, but I need a meal.
Yeah, I loved your differentiation between being mentoring versus monitoring our children. I think that's really huge. Recently, I watched this film called Childhood 2.0. Have you seen that film?
Childhood 2.0, I have not.
It is about how social media, this whole digital technology, it's all affecting our children. They interviewed parents and children separately in different rooms, diverse children, like high school kids, younger kids. They talked about all the things that you talk about in your book. But what I found interesting was, okay, yet another film, yet another documentary who talks about, this is terrible. What do we do about this? It sort of raises the awareness that there are problems, but okay, it confuses parents. What do we do? What are the solutions? Where do we look for solutions? I think we do need, that's why I like your approach. It's more balanced. It's not like extremist. Oh my gosh, my kid did this. Calm down. You got this. We can handle this. But one thing stood out to me in that documentary was parents still believe that real world physical dangers are a thing, like kidnapping, and they worry more about those kinds of dangers, and they are very sort of unaware of dangers online. It seems like they didn't know the extent of dangers online exposure life could bring. Is this really a thing?
Yeah, I think parents tend to worry about the wrong things online. They tend to worry even, I think parents tend to worry about the like very extreme stuff. I think parents worry about, these very extreme, like my kid's going to meet someone on Discord and they're going to be kidnapped by that person, or my kid's going to get on like a dating app and be trafficked. And, those things are concerning, but I would be more focused on, and they happen sometimes, but they're not as likely as the sort of everyday stuff, right? Like your kid is going to feel left out because they see everyone posting about a party. That's like going to happen. That is like 100% going to happen. Your kid will see somebody's party and feel left out. And so we need to also parent around these kind of more everyday challenges in digital and not only focus on the extreme, dangers. And I also think we need to teach kids that there are nice strangers and that you can sometimes connect with people that you meet on the internet. I mean, that's sort of like an advanced lesson that we might want to teach, but it's something we can talk with older kids about. Like if you're in a Discord community, you might get to be friends with someone over time, or you might meet someone, in another kind of online group. And what are the safe ways to get to know? Like, what's the way you can validate someone's identity? Can you FaceTime them before you meet them? Can you, if your kid is younger, could you ask to meet the kid and the parents, on a FaceTime call? Like if, like most pedophiles are not going to like hire actors to play a family to sit and have an hour-long FaceTime with you before your kid goes to the next town to meet them. They're going to pick a more vulnerable kid. I mean, I'm just being real here. Like they're like the kid whose parents are like, well, you can meet that kid, but we need to sit down with them and their family on FaceTime before you meet in person. And then I'm going to go with you to meet them. That's not going to be the kid who's like more vulnerable to meeting a bad stranger. Like that bad stranger is going to like be like, oh, this kid has parents who are pretty like on top of them. So I think it's important to think about, but we don't want to, I think, teach kids that like strangers are all bad. I mean, I think we want to teach kids that there are nice strangers, asking the librarian in the young adult section where a book is, or how to use the computer, that's a good stranger, right? I mean, I always use the library as an example, but I think our kids are so afraid to talk to anyone sometimes in person. So we want to also teach them how to do that in an in-person setting. And if they are connecting with someone online, we do want to verify their identity. We don't want to say like, oh, I'm in love with someone, I have an internet, boyfriend or girlfriend, and like have no idea if that person is real, or a best friend. Some kids do tell me, like when I'll go out to schools, some kids will say like, oh, my best friend's in New Zealand, or, whatever, like I've met this person online. And I do get a little concerned, especially if that's their primary friendship circle and they're not looking in person. But the flip side is I'm here talking to you because we met on the internet, right? And so many of my adult relationships are people I met on the internet. So I don't think we want to completely, suggest that that's always a bad way to connect. My dad's married to someone he met on the internet, like, do we want to say like, oh, like Bubby and Grandpa, like that's so dangerous, they met on the internet? No, I think we want to say like, that's a J-date success story.
Oh, that's so true. I want to ask you about, parents surveilling their children, putting those geo trackers, or monitoring, reading their text messages. What could you say about best practices for parents, and what is driving parents to do that in the first place? And what are the consequences?
Yeah, I mean, bottom line, I don't think we want to be reading our kids' texts most of the time. It's a good way to relive the trauma of middle school or high school without learning as much about our kids as we will from talking to them. So bottom line, I don't think we want to be doing it. If your kid is a new texter, like they just got a phone, that might be a time where you might want to say to them, hey, let's look at this together and see how it's going. Or if your kid is struggling with something, you could say, may I look with you at the conversation to see if I can get some insights about what might be going wrong here. But we don't want to get into reading their text, especially without their knowledge. I think it's so important that if we are reading our kids' text, we're doing it ideally with them, or at least with their knowledge, and that we're not covertly spying on our kids. Because what do you do if you're covertly spying and you see something? And how do you say something? How do you address it with your kid if you've never told them you were there?
Yeah. Oh my goodness. But I've even heard stories, parents texting other kids through their children's phone.
You definitely don't want to do that. I mean, I understand, because I'll just disclose, like I've had that temptation to sometimes do that with a teacher, like where I'm like, oh, I could just explain this in a better way. But then I'm like, wait a minute, that's my son's life. Like I can't pretend to be him and explain this to the teacher for him. Like he's got to do that himself. And it's going to come out sounding more like a middle schooler, but guess what? He's a middle schooler. You know what I mean? And guess what? Your kids' teachers in middle school, they've seen that before. Your kid's not the only one who doesn't have perfect communication skills.
But so when do parents need to be concerned about their children's online behaviors, or, texting? Things could, okay, if we allow privacy and, don't read their messages and all of that, Where is that line? When do we need to interfere? And what are the red flags that our child might be going through something?
I mean, if you see your kids' behavior change, if you see them get withdrawn, if you see their sleep patterns change, if you see them not engaging with kids that they've engaged with before and they don't seem to have friends, like it's one thing to shift friend groups, it's another thing to like not have a friend at all. Like most kids need at least one friend, right? They don't need a million friends, but if they don't have one friend, I'd be concerned if they seem very worried. And that might mean they have a friend in crisis, by the way. It might not be your kid that's in the immediate crisis, but they might be trying to carry a friend through a crisis. Especially teenagers really try to show up for their friends a lot, but sometimes it might be more they can handle on their own. So I think those are some things to kind of look at with kids and just, notice. Ideally, kids don't have their phones in their room with them at night because that is a time when they really need to be sleeping. As kids get older, they might be responsible enough to turn it off. But especially younger adolescents, I think really will struggle with self-regulating around having their phone in their bedroom at night. And nothing good happens on the group text at night. Nothing good happens in social media at night. Your inhibition is lower. The level of conflict might be higher. Just not great. So that's a good time to unplug because we know sleep is so important for kids' physical and mental health.
But I think most parents come from a fear-based approach. They take they use this more punitive approach, take the device away for a month or something. If I catch you, can you speak about, relinquishing fear-based parenting approach when it comes to technology, social media, and, how can parents be an ally as opposed to this, I'm going to get you, I'm going to catch you type of way, because that's not going to have, positive consequences for sure.
Yeah. I mean, we want to teach kids to do the right thing and ultimately not just like catch them doing the wrong thing. And so it's a lot of work and it's a lot of effort to teach kids to do the right thing. And it's not always easy. So I do think we want to model doing the right things ourselves. We want to model how we handle conflict. If we're in conflict with someone and the texting isn't going well, we might want to switch to an in-person conversation. We want to model being empathetic. We want to model what a really good apology looks like. Kids have no idea what a good apology looks like unless we model that. And hopefully, you've probably messed up with your kid at some point. So hopefully you've apologized to them and shown them what a real apology looks like and what it means to try to actually do better as opposed to apologizing and then continuing to do the same problematic thing. And so we want to show kids, what does a real apology look like and what does doing better look like? And that's a really important thing to model. So I think moving away from fear-based parenting with tech is so important because what the last thing we want to do is have our kids hiding from us. We don't want our kids hiding secrets, having secret accounts, going underground, starting an account on a friend's phone or, using an email address we don't know about. And the more we just try to police them, especially without empathy, like it's one thing to be curious and aware and open and in conversation with them. But if we try to police them and we're always kind of punitive around what they do online and we don't have a plan to how to teach them how to do better or function independently, they're very likely to hide from us. And then they really are more vulnerable if something goes very badly because they don't have us as a resource to help them problem solve.
Yeah. From your book, just to conclude this topic, 61% of parents reported checking their teens' website browsing history. That's more than half of parents. 48% reported looking at their teens' phone call log or text messages. That's a large number. 48% reported having access to their teens' email account. 43% reported having access to their teens' phone passcode. I'm not in the 43% for sure. 39% reported using parental control apps to monitor their teens' online activity. And 16% reported using monitoring apps to track their teens' location through their phone. I mean, this tracking the location, that's so insane. I mean, are there any upsides to that? I mean, I feel like for a parent constantly tracking, it's a source of anxiety. Like, don't we have other things to worry about, like real life issues? This becomes an obsession. And as a parent, I would say that I have very rarely looked at the parent portal of my daughter's school. Only when the new year begins and they send paperwork,
Right.
I fill out. I never look at her grades. I never look at her anything.
Well, I think that grading apps are very pernicious. The grading apps have really caused a lot of problems for some families because they really can undermine trust between parents, teachers, and students. I mean, what happens is you see something on there, or you see a 0 and you reach out to the teacher too soon and she hasn't had a chance to enter the grade. And I mean, I would say unless your kid is really struggling in school, and maybe then you have a plan to look at it together, maybe once a week or every other week. But I certainly think looking at it every day is way too much. And a lot of parents tell me they're looking every day, their kids are looking every day. So you also have the grading apps can really be a source of stress for kids. And I will tell kids sometimes to take them off your phone so that you have to go to a computer and maybe even keep the password in a drawer. So it creates friction. So you're not just checking it, for whatever. And you never want to be checking grades in one class while you're sitting in another class or getting a new grade from one class, because that's going to distract you when you need to be focusing on something else. So I think the grading apps actually are sort of a secret problem that we don't talk about enough. Like I think people understand why Life 360 or geolocation tracking is maybe undermining trust in families. I will say, so for the people who liked it, because I have to stick up for, like I also am in the anti-location tracking camp. But for the people who liked it, they said it's convenient. And some of them said, I'm actually nagging and worrying about my kid less and texting them less to quote unquote check in if I could just see their location. So that was the argument that I heard. And I guess I can understand, like maybe if my kid's on like a solo road trip through the desert or something, and I want to just like track his location, or people talked about prom night and they're worried about driving. So I want to have empathy for the parents who are so anxious, because I have other kinds of anxiety as a parent. I'm not a relaxed person. I have anxieties too. So my anxieties are different than that, but I just want to have empathy for why we live in a world that's worrisome. We live in a world that presents us with some terrible things. And it's understandable that parents would want to track sometimes because of that. And a lot of us feel like because we can check the grades, we should, because we can track location, we should, like, because the technology exists, we should just use it. And I think that's a problem.
Yeah, I mean, what are you getting out of geolocation tracking? Let's say your child is somewhere else in a different town. Okay, you know where they are, and maybe there is a potential danger. What can a parent do, right? I think trusting the kid that they can call 911 if need be, or have friends who can participate and act, be proactive, as opposed to parent. I'm not sure if that's even useful if you're far away, but you know where they are and they are in trouble. Again, I think trusting our kids to lead their lives, develop life skills to live independently one day is so important.
I do think, though, if you're in a community where everyone tracks their kids, it feels like, oh, this is what good parents do.
Mm.
And so that's why we have to resist, but we can also talk to other people and really try to understand, because I think the grading apps in particular, a lot of kids felt very undermined in their trust. And a lot of the kids I talked to were very conscientious students. And they're like, when my mom checks my grades and, attacks me when I walk in the door almost and says, like, why did you get this grade on this test before I've even seen what my grade was? That's very undermining of the relationship, not just between you and your child, but between your child and their teacher. It's actually undermining a bunch of relationships because, sometimes the child might be able to, for example, first of all, it might be fine. And there's like just a lag sometimes between when things get entered. Secondly, your child may already know that there's an issue and have already worked it out with their teacher that they're going to retake the test or something else. Or the assignment was late, but maybe they asked for permission for the assignment to be late and they've already gotten an extension. So by you getting involved and especially sort of pouncing on a kid who's coming in for the day and saying, or texting them during the school day, even parents have told me and kids have told me, don't do that, right? Like, I think that's incredibly disruptive, again, to your relationship and to your child's relationship with their teachers. Ultimately, if there's a big problem with school, that's a bigger conversation, but that's also a conversation that's not going to be solved, honestly, by daily monitoring, but looking at what are the supports that my child needs to be successful, which is a different question to ask.
Over the years, I mean, you've been writing about this, you've written books, you've taught, this is your area of expertise. What I want to know is, what are some things that you have to come believe even strongly, seeing the data, seeing the research, living in the world yourself? And what are some things that you changed your ideas on, if any?
I love that question. By talking to kids, I did really learn why things like grading apps and location tracking are so problematic and how they undermine their relationships with parents and teachers. And I also really did learn that kids are sharing about themselves in very different ways and that they're changing the culture by doing it. And I was a little bit more in the like, oh, don't overshare kind of mentality before I talked to kids. And then I did learn that kids are sharing in thoughtful, interesting ways that are changing the culture. The flip side is, kids are very vulnerable when they share, and some kids are more socially vulnerable when they share than others. A kid who's in recovery, coming home from the hospital, for example, who shares about that may be in a really vulnerable situation. We may want to encourage kids to have a sacred circle and think in a smaller way of, think about who really needs to know this and should this be on social media. But I do think it's really important to validate too the ways kids are changing the culture and sharing in different ways than we did.
Yeah, I think to conclude our conversation, I want to talk about sexting, which is a big concern.
Great topic.
Parents are really scared just by hearing the word. We don't know what to do. It's a new phenomenon. You report in your book, Journal JAMA, 15% of 12 to 17-year-olds sent nude pictures, and 27% have received. So what are some conversations we need to have with our children? Like, what's going on? How can we be supportive to our children as opposed to judgmental and harsh approach? Because that's not going to yield to anything, right? Just saying, don't do it, that's not going to work.
When we talk to kids about sending nudes, and they don't really use the term sexting among themselves, but when we talk to kids about sending nudes or underwear pictures or, sexy pictures, we want to really make sure we're clear that we say, look, there's nothing shameful about having sexual feelings, about being attracted to someone, about wanting someone to be attracted to you, about wanting to be cute, wanting people to be interested, flirting. And people may send nudes or, again, like sort of sexy pictures or revealing pictures for any of those reasons. But we'd never, ever want to send a picture like that unbidden, because that's harassment, right? If I take a picture of my genitals or with my top off and I send it to someone who doesn't want that picture, isn't asking for that picture, that's harassment. So that's a consent issue. And if someone sends me a picture like that, that's harassment, right? So I'm free to like block them, and that's not okay for them to do. And most importantly, what we want to say to our kids is, we don't live in a world where this is a safe way for you to express your sexuality. It's illegal for minors to do it, but more importantly, it's just not safe because there's so little privacy. It would be so easy for the person you send it to leave their phone on the kitchen table and their dad sees it. It would be so easy for, unfortunately, if one of their friends grabbed their phone, for them to take and share their picture. Let alone, unfortunately, when relationships end, people do horrible things for revenge. I wouldn't even emphasize that to kids, because to say like the person you're in love with would do that to you is like even a horrible thing to say. But kids know that happens. And especially girls are very aware of the potential for exploitation and for those images to get out there. And there are practices that kids take to be a little bit safer when they share pictures, to be less recognizable, for example, and not have their face in a picture. And I think as much as we worry about like, oh, well, that's going to encourage kids to sext, is like talking about safer sexting, there are practices that I cite in the book that researchers talk about that can make it a somewhat safer experience. But we have to blanket that whole conversation with, ideally, we don't want you to do it. And again, not because it's shameful, not because there's anything wrong with your body, your desires, but because we don't live in a world where this is a safe way for people to express their sexuality, especially kids, especially people under 18. And it is so easy for images and videos and things like that to get out of our control. And so we want to be so clear with kids that it's an understandable impulse, and that we're not trying to shame them, but we don't want them to do it because it's not safe. And we need to make sure we're clear with them that if they have done it and they now have worries about having done it, that paramount is we still have total respect for them. We haven't lost any respect for them. It's not, we don't respect them or, that we think any less of them, but just we want to help them try to rein that photo in, to get it back under control if possible, and to move forward. And there may be, depending on what has happened, like legal steps to be taken, safety steps at school, all kinds of things. Now, a kid who is harassed for a photo, or someone has gotten a photo of them in a way without their consent, that's even a next level of they need our protection and support. So the reason we don't want to just scare kids around sharing nudes is we want to make sure that they can come and talk to us if they have shared an image. It's so important that they have access to our support if they need help navigating that situation.
You write that girls pay a higher social price when it comes to this issue. And you highlighted, I think, three things I have in my notes. You said that they watermark their images so that they send to a particular person. They know when that person leaks the image, they know who sent that picture to other people. They also send not their own nudes pictures. If somebody pressures them to send pictures, it seems like you talked about that as well. What was interesting, you talked about laws have not changed. There was a case in our state, a few towns away recently, that two 13-year-olds got into a sexual act. They videotaped it, they shared it publicly, and she got pregnant, this little girl. And obviously, you can just imagine the parents' reaction. Law enforcement was involved because it was already distribution, it was child pornography, it's all of the above. But you talk about that, but they are kids, and laws have to be more nuanced and take into consideration that they're kids and not be punished by the same law as adults. Can you speak about this? I found that very fascinating, and I never considered that.
The laws just haven't caught up with, what can happen. And that's why you should be very careful if someone wants your kid to turn in their phone, there was a bullying situation recently where, other kids who were adjacent to what happened were brought to the police station and told, turn in their phone. Well, be careful what happens if your kid is turning their phone, and make sure you've considered all the legal ramifications. Because what if your kid, for example, took a picture of herself in the dressing room topless, and just had it on her own phone? Because some kids will do that to literally just see an image of themselves. They literally aren't sharing it, but they want to see, oh, how do I look? And our phones are always with us, right? So we never had that choice when we were kids to maybe create an image like that. But if your kid has that image on their phone, guess what? They self-produce child pornography. So even if they literally didn't distribute it or anything, so you don't want the police finding that picture and potentially prosecuting your child. I mean, most people at this point wouldn't do that, wouldn't make that choice, because obviously it's a choice to, prosecute a child. But I do think it's important to recognize these latent and I think problematic laws. I think obviously, a situation that's where someone has been coerced or, absolutely they should be prosecuted. And absolutely, if someone is threatening your kid and blackmailing your kid with nudes, that person should, get a lawyer letter. I'm not saying that the law shouldn't touch any of this. I just think, for example, two 15-year-olds who consensually exchange images and someone just happens to find the phone and it never gets out, other than they did keep it private, to make those kids criminals for a consensual act doesn't make any sense, right? That doesn't make any sense. And it's a miscarriage of justice. It's shaming kids unnecessarily. It's creating a headache and an overburdened legal system. These are not the kinds of crimes we should be looking for. And so I think we really need to look at the difference between self-production and other production. Obviously, an adult making an image of a kid is very different than a kid making an image of themselves, and specifically doing it consensually by their own choice is different than being harassed or cajoled, into doing it. So I think the worries we should have are, when people are being groomed, when people are being told to make these images. And there are situations, unfortunately, yes, there are situations where, adults have gotten kids to self-produce images and then they threaten them, right? And so the classic threat would be, if you don't send more, I'll expose the images you've already sent. So that's why if your kid is really worried or going into their room or, wanting more privacy and their behavior is changing, I would be very concerned, because that might not be the most likely thing. It's probably a simpler situation, but that could be happening if your kid could be being exploited, and it could be someone they knew in person, or it could be someone they met online. So I don't want to scare parents, because that's not a common scenario, but it does happen. And that's why we need the lines of communication to be open, because then that threat is defanged. If someone says, if you, don't do what I say, I'll tell your mom, and your mom will be on your side no matter what, that's less of a threat. And you're going to go to your mom, hopefully, and say, somebody's threatening me, and saying they're going to tell you. Even in a very supportive family, no kid wants to be seen in a sexual way by their parents. So of course, if there's a video out there of your kid nude or masturbating or something, of course your kid won't want you to see that, but hopefully they would recognize that for you, their safety would be more important than the moment of oh, I didn't really want to see that. That's a private moment. Or that's not a way that I want to see my kid. But I do think it's important for kids to recognize and to really say to kids over the course of their lifetime, whether they're 8 years old or 17, no one should be able to threaten you with exposure to me. Like I'm always going to be on your side. And so that shouldn't be a threat. And that you can always come to me, even if you've made a decision you regret, like sharing a nude photo, you can still come to me and I'll still be on your side. So I think as much as we want to prevent, we also need to make sure our language isn't so strong on the prevention side that our kids can't talk to us.
It's very tricky to parent in today's world for sure, especially for us who grew up in this don't share taboo culture, right? We came from, it's very difficult. But you're right, being on our child's side and creating that openness, the communication, protecting our children. I think that should be our main focus, support, protection, instead of punish. What is my child doing wrong? Why? And not projecting our own anxieties onto our children, I think is important too. And what are some really important messages what are you passionate about this work? What are some central points that you want to convey to parents?
I think we just need to talk with kids about social media and be really honest about the ups and downsides, the short-term pleasures and rewards, and why we want to really also focus on the deeper relationships of, the friends that we know beyond social media and the ways that we can connect with people. A phone call or an in-person hang is very different than just sharing some texts, for example. So we want to be really clear with our kids about that and be supportive of the ways they're connecting with others, have conversations with them about reputation where we also focus on the positive. Maybe you shared something on LinkedIn and it led to you getting a grant or a collaboration opportunity or a new job. And so we don't want to only focus on the negative side of online communities because there's a lot that's happening that's positive despite all the challenges, right? So we want to make sure we're giving kids a window into our own balance of in-person and digital. And we want to make sure we're supportive of them and their experiences, and that we recognize that this is a really central part for many of them of their lives. Not all kids are on social media, but for the kids who are using it, it plays a big role.
I think to conclude, can you say about empathy and character building versus consequences? I really liked what you said in the beginning.
Yeah. So I think we really want to focus on character and who is your kid? Who are they as they're growing up what kind of friend are they? What kind of person are they? What kind of member of their community are they? What do they care about? And not so much on, oh, you won't get into a fancy college, you won't get into Princeton or Berkeley if you post that. I think that's so important that we want to not emphasize, oh, if you post that and get caught, it's going to be a problem, but instead focus on, what can we do to show up for ourselves and each other? How can we be our best selves?
Speaking of colleges, you wrote in your book that it doesn't seem like the admission officers look at children's social media when they make a judgment, because everybody is using social media. They are using TikTok and things of this nature. I don't know how much.
Yeah, college is very unlikely to look at your social media unless you send them there, unless you're like, I'm a champion skateboarder, here's my social media, or something. But they're not likely to try to look it up. They're getting thousands and thousands of applicants. They have 10 minutes to look at your file. So unless someone takes it upon themselves, like maybe you did something really horrendous and they have a video and they don't want you to have that place and they know where you're applying. So think about a few very competitive schools where this might happen. Someone might try intentionally to sabotage your chances. But if you're just a regular person and sharing in a regular way and applying to college, nobody's going to do that to you. And everyone has a situation where they've said a bad word online or something like that. It really is like a swear word. I don't mean like a hateful word or a slur, but the sort of dumb stuff that kids do, like text silly pictures of themselves or a rude gesture. You'll still get into college. A, nobody's going to see it, and B, everyone's got it, right? So it sort of would be like eliminating everyone who would apply. I think obviously if there's something much more serious, then you'll need to think about what you're going to do about that if that's going around. But that's a very small number of kids. And I do have some guidelines and suggestions for families where they are dealing with a more serious kind of scandal level situation, like what, things you've talked about, like in different communities that you're familiar with. But for most of our kids, social media is not going to be part of the equation at all when they apply to college. So we need to instead talk to them about what other people will actually see. So when you're applying to a babysitting job, that parent might look at your social media. When you're on a group text, people are seeing it that you're not remembering. You might have teachers at your school who are also parents at your school, and they might see something you say in a group text. So you do want to think about what you share, but not in the sense of, oh, you won't get into college, but just in the sense of this is what people will think of you. And we never want to share anything that will cause harm because we don't want to cause harm, not because we don't want to get caught and not get into Harvard, but because we don't want to cause harm. Like those kids who are making the jokes a few years ago about the Holocaust, like you don't not joke about the Holocaust because you won't get into Harvard. You don't joke about the Holocaust because it's not funny. Right. And that's the point with kids. Like we really need to talk to them about character and not being misunderstood and not causing harm. And it shouldn't be about you get caught and you don't get this prize of getting into a fancy college.
Yeah, it's such good point. I really love that. Again, it comes down to relinquishing our fear-based parenting approach and maybe thinking a little deeply and not superficially, just saying things out of reaction, rather being more proactive. I think it's key in focusing on the character and the larger picture is so important. I love that point. Thank you so much. Is there anything you want to say as parting tips, words, message to the parents? I know your book covers a lot and, we can't go into detail into every chapter, but I really enjoyed all of the chapters. Even there was a chapter about the apps for schools, that they use. That was quite interesting. So it's a lot. If parents are really struggling, they need to pick up, or they want to learn more, they need to pick up a copy of your book because you put really great stories, helpful tips in every chapter. I found it very helpful and useful. So anything to conclude?
I think the main thing we want to do is just be in conversation with our kids, be in conversation with one another, be curious, pay attention to how we're using tech and social media. We are not immune from wanting to be liked and wanting to be noticed. All of us are posting for attention, right? And so just trying to balance that with some good, supportive relationships and make sure that kids have other sources of self-esteem, right? Being active in the community, helping out at home, emptying the dishwasher, feeding the dog, like these are the things that help us feel needed and feel important in life and feel a good sense of self-esteem. And so we want to make sure that our kids aren't just getting all of that just from the likes online. And we need to look at ourselves for that as well and be good models as they're growing up in public. We are also kind of, growing older in public and just also have fun with it. If you enjoy TikTok and you want to look at it with your kids, or you enjoy video games and you want to do those things with your kids, that can also be a source of connection.
Yeah, true. My kid made me do a TikTok the other day. I'm not on TikTok, but sometimes she makes me do those funny things. But she says she's not posting it publicly. She's just trying it out with her mom, even though I doubt that she might be sharing with a few close friends. But that's okay, making fun of your mom is okay too.
If it's done in a nice way, yeah, it's good to have a sense of humor about it.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your presence, your sharing, your expertise, and good luck with the book and with other upcoming projects.
Thank you. Thank you. I hope that if folks are listening and this is helpful, I hope you read it, and feel free to come and find me on social media and on Substack and all the places. And also in real life, I'm happy to come out to people's communities. I do a lot of speaking and now I'm on the road again more. So it's a good time. Thank you so much for the wonderful conversation.